Hey guys, this is Robert Breedlove from the What is Money show. And as you've learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to facilitate financial security for all. They accomplish this by bringing a high level of professionalization and sophistication to the Bitcoin marketplace. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. By using NYDIG, you will gain access to an end-to-end institutional-grade platform, providing Bitcoin OTC transactions, Bitcoin collateralized borrowing, secure custody, asset management, derivatives, financing, market research, and more. And all of these services meet the highest regulatory, governance, and audit standards. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and is leading the way for ongoing institutional adoption in this nascent asset class. So please be sure to check out NYDIG as a single source for all your Bitcoin needs. Welcome back to the What is Money show. I am sitting down today with author Bob Murphy, who's written a great book called Choice, pictured here. And this book, as I was just describing to Bob offline, I think is an excellent bridge between most people and the book Human Action, which is, I guess it is the premier book of Austrian economics. Maybe Rothbard's Man, Economy, Estate is up there as well. Would you agree with that, Bob, or is there?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly right. So the three contenders among people who are associated with the Mises Institute, let's say, because there's different sort of wings in the Austrian, modern Austrian school. We can talk about that if you want to at some point. But yeah, the group with whom I'm associated, yeah, it would be, they would probably, if they had to pick one, say, yeah, Mises Human Action, which came out in 1949. Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, which I think is 62. It's in the early 60s. I think it's 62. Or they might say Karl Menger's Principles of Economics in 1871, which was like literally the foundation of the Austrian school.
Right.
So yeah, it would be one of those three, but certainly in the modern Austrian school and what gives it its definition and whatnot. Yeah, Mises' Human Action is, his magnum opus. It's got everything in there. So yes, that's one distinction. Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State is more narrowly an economic treatise, whereas Mises kind of talks about all kinds of stuff, political philosophy, everything is in there.
Yes. Yeah, it's very much a philosophical work, which I appreciate. Difficult to read, I guess because it's translated from German, and the way he handles English is unlike anyone I've ever read before. It's just very dense. But he doesn't mince words. It seems to be very packed with meaning. So it's an excellent book.
If I could just comment on that. So my understanding is you're right. So he originally wrote his treatise, National Economy, with the dots over the O's and stuff, by the way they do it in German. But Human Action, my understanding, it wasn't a translation per se. Like Mises did sit down and write that from scratch in English using National Economy as a guide. But you're right. Like it's very Germanic in its, the sentences are real long, and he uses very, instead of just saying this term is redundant, he'll say this term is pleonastic. So It's like English is not by any stretch his first language, and yet he has a huge vocabulary. So you're right. And beyond that, it's not just that the language is difficult, but Mises assumes he's writing for a Renaissance man. That he just makes offhand remarks about quantum physics and Goethe and Plato and Roman history, as if everybody knows all that stuff.
Yes.
And, so.
Yeah, it definitely presupposes a very wide and deep basis of knowledge. But it's great. I mean, I read it on a Kindle, and I found myself defining a lot of terms, just like you just referred to. So it's really a mind expanding book, but because it's written that way, it's largely inaccessible to a lot of audiences. And that's why I think your book has done an amazing job of distilling these concepts down into something that's more accessible for a broader audience. So
Well, thank you for saying that. And just for the benefit of your viewers, that's literally what I was commissioned to do, right? So that was the function of my book choice.
Yes.
Was they literally told me, write something that's 350 pages that takes the most important stuff in human action and distills it down so it could be plausibly assigned to an undergrad college class.
Yes.
And they would get it. And so that's what my mission was. And you and lots of other people have said that, that's what I did in that. So I was glad to see that apparently I pulled that off.
Yeah. Well, you're the man for the job because it's a mission accomplished and well done. And I found it especially enjoyable after reading Human Action, actually, because you read that book and you're left kind of, your head hurts a little bit. You've learned a lot, but I was rereading parts of it recently. I always find new insights in there. So it's just so packed. You can't get it all in one pass, but going through your book after the fact it helped open it up for me as well. So I think they complement one another really well.
Thanks for saying that. And also, I should stress that it's, I don't want my book to be a substitute for it. Ideally it'll unlock human action, introduce it, and some people might go on to read it. But yes, at the same time, being practical, we know not everyone's going to sit down and read a 900-page economics treatise. And so, my book might give those insights to people that otherwise wouldn't have gotten it.
Yes. It's a very serious undertaking. I think I spent 6 months reading it very seriously every day to get through it. So maybe we could start here. I think a general consensus among Austrian economists is that what most people call economics or economic science in the world today is anything but. We have been, I don't know if you want to use the word indoctrinated or just we've gone astray from the axioms or the first principles of economics, and we've got into this more this scientific let's use the term scientism version of economics that most people refer to as Keynesianism. Mises, and I think this is in the opening rubric as well, Mises describes economics as the youngest of all sciences. So I think that's a really important way to look at it, that we're actually dealing with something that's kind of emergent in a lot of ways. Our understanding of this science is very young and new. So maybe we could start with that, just how this emergent science we call economics differs from logic, math, psychology, physics, biology, and how it also differs from what many of us are told is economic science today. So I guess maybe drawing the distinction between Austrian and Keynesian economics, and also how economics as a science differs from all of these other mainstream scientific disciplines.
Okay, sure. So great questions. I'll say some stuff, and then in the interest of keeping it a conversation, I'll cut myself short, and then tell me if you want me to elaborate on any of these stubs. Historically, there was, markets existed before people studied them, and then people did start noticing certain patterns or regularities in market phenomena, and then patterns in the prices and how they moved. And then, the ruler would debase the coinage, and then these were the effects and things like this. They'd have price controls, and these would be the effects. So various writers, you can go back, Aristotle wrote on economic topics, and of course the Middle Ages, and lots of church scholars and so forth. And so what Mises said, though, is, and it says in Human Action, that economics, this study of the market economy eventually became its own discipline, and people realized that it wasn't math, it wasn't history, it also, wasn't a natural science, it wasn't like chemistry or physics, and so it was its own thing, and eventually called economics. But in Mises' view, it had a particular method that should go along with it, like the way you deduce laws of economics was according to a certain way, and that what ended up happening in the 20th century with the success of the physicists in particular, like it was, 1930s, 1940s, especially the atomic bomb, the physicists seemed like they were the smartest guys in the room, and actually they probably were.
Yeah.
And so the economists thought, to be rigorous, to really be a science, we have to adopt the methods that they use in the natural or physical sciences. Namely, you come up with hypotheses that have testable implications. You say, okay, if my theory were true, this is what experiments or observations would yield. And then you go run the experiment, or you conduct the observations, and you see, is it right or not? And if it's right, okay, you withhold judgment. But if your theory is wrong, if it's falsified, then it can't be right. You toss it out.
Right.
And so, and Mises argued that for one thing, that's actually a crude description of what even happens in like physics or something. That's actually not really the way they do it in practice. But put that aside, he's saying with economics, it's more akin to geometry in the sense that what you do in economics is you start from the action axiom, the idea or the insight that people act, they use means to achieve subjective ends. And then you can logically deduce a lot of things from that. Stuff like every choice has an opportunity cost. There are trade-offs. Decisions are made on the margin, things like that. We can elaborate on those if you want. And then that's how you come up with theorems in economics. So Mises uses that term. Lots of economists, use the term theory, but Mises actually calls them theorems. And that's because in math, that's what you do. You prove a theorem. So I'll end with this, so your viewers, in case they've never heard this before, it might sound like, so this is just like dogma. This is like theology or something. And you guys are just arguing. Well, no, think about geometry again as the analogy. When your teacher in school shows you the Pythagorean theorem to say, if you have a right triangle, the sum of the squares of the two sides equals the square of the hypotenuse. If a student said, well, how do we know that's true? The teacher would say, well, there's various proofs. And here, go on Wikipedia and look at, there's lots of ways to prove that.
Right.
And it wouldn't be go take out a ruler and a compass and go measure 1,000 triangles and see if you can come up with a counterexample. And like, that's just not, and if the teacher did say that, they would be doing a disservice to the students, because then the students would have the wrong idea of how you establish truth in geometry. Right. They would think it's an empirical science when it's not. Yes. So that's what Mises thought like basic economic law is. And I'll just say one last thing to avoid confusing people or misleading them. Mises was not against collecting data for economic topics. He actually helped found a center to study business cycles that Hayek, that was one of his early positions.
Yes.
When Hayek was up and coming. So it's not that Mises said, oh no, I don't want to look at numbers. Don't trouble me with facts. But he was just saying the framework that you use to parse the data, the basic economic principles or laws, that's something you logically deduce to help you then go make sense of the world.
Right. So there's this division between, I guess, economics and economic history, where economics is establishing these theorems, again, deduced from an axiom, right? Man must act, for instance. And then you're using those theorems deduced to interpret historical events or historical data. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, okay. Right. Yeah, that's true. And you're right. Economic history, would say, what happened in the 70s, and crude oil prices did this, and blah blah blah. And yes, you can have a bunch of data and historical facts that you collect, but right, the actual determination of economic laws, that's something that you use through deduction or introspection.
Yes.
And then you could go apply them to historical events. So, if you're trying to understand, Diocletian put in place price controls, and then all of a sudden there were shortages, we can look at the historical data and look at somebody's diary or whatever to understand what happened. But to know that price controls cause shortage, or if they're a ceiling, cause a shortage, that's something you would deduce logically. That's not merely, because we looked at all the instances of price controls in history and there was a 97.3% probability. That's not the way you do it.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the important point to hold on to there is, I love the analogy to Euclidean geometry because it's similar, right? It's reasoned from, I think there's 5 Euclidean axioms, and then he, produces the whole framework of Euclidean geometry. One of them being like, I think one of them is two parallel lines never intersect. If you were to try to go out into the world and test that, I mean, what would you test every set of parallel lines in the universe before you could actually prove it? It just doesn't make sense. So it's almost like you get this axiom to depend on, and then take the observations of the world and map it to that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, whereas Keynesian economics is more like the physics envy you described earlier, where everything needs to be measured, and they want to go out and test all the parallel lines in the universe and describe that they never intersect. Is that roughly the difference there?
So yeah, I'm okay with what you just said. Let me take your examples and try to like say it in slightly different words just to make sure the viewers, are getting. So, and also I want to, because I debated David Friedman once on this stuff at PorcFest one year, and he was bringing up the, stuff with, he was sort of like, oh, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but it's sort of like, oh, I'm surprised Dr. Murphy would say this because he should know that, in physics, actually, we believe that the universe, the real world, space-time continuum is not Euclidean. In fact, because space is curved, and so like
right.
on a globe, parallel lines actually do intersect with North and South Pole, right?
Yeah.
And so because it's curved, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't disprove Euclid. It's not that Euclidean geometry is wrong. It's not that Pythagoras is wrong. With his alleged theorem, there's a mistake. Yes. No, the way you would deal with that is, like you say, you would go back to the axioms in Euclidean geometry and say these apparently, according to our observations, are actually not true in our physical universe, the material universe in which we live. And so that's why these conclusions don't hold. And so, but it's still, if you wanted to prove the Pythagorean theorem in a geometry class, you still prove it the standard way. You start with the axioms and you step by step deduce it.
Right.
And you'd be doing a disservice if you said to your students, go test, to see if the theorem is true.
Yes.
So when it comes to economics, you're right. That's the way you go ahead and do it. And it's maybe a better or a good example of this is if people have talked about or thought about free trade and the issue like, can putting in place tariffs create jobs and make our country wealthier by keeping out cheap imports? And there's lots of thought experiments that economists have done over the years, like, oh, imagine two countries and there's two goods and the comparative advantage, or Bastiat's famous petition of the candle makers. It's a satirical letter that he's pretending to be representing the candle makers of France, and they're petitioning the parliament to pass a resolution that all the shutters have to be closed in France during the day to keep out the unfair competition from the sun. And so if we keep out all the sunlight, people will have to buy more candles, to provide indoor lighting. Yeah. And then they just go through and look at all the jobs that would create, because we would sell more candles, we'd have to hire more. And clearly that's crazy, right? Yes. And so then the point is when you stop and put your finger on, well, why is that crazy? Then you realize, okay, if it's dumb to keep out the free import of sunlight, well, then also if England is sending us wool that's cheaper than we can make domestically in France, it would likewise be dumb to keep that out in order to provide jobs for our, people in husbandry. Yes. So my point though is it's like thinking through the logic of it. And once you see that insight and realize the fallacies of protectionism, then you're a free trader, right?
Yes.
And it's not that you didn't get there by running a bunch of regressions and saying, when tariff barriers were lowered, it looks like, with a, confidence of 5% or blah, 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 that's not the way you do it. And so I think it's even a lot of economists who don't call themselves Austrians and think that they're doing the so-called scientific method in practice. The reason they believe in free trade is because of like reading an essay like Bastiat's or working through a very unrealistic, simple example with numbers of like I said, two countries and two goods. And like, once you see the logic of comparative advantage, you can't unsee it. Yeah. It's like, oh my gosh, there it is right there. So that's kind of where the Austrians are coming from. They're saying, just don't be ashamed of that. Like, embrace it in economics. That is how we gain insight. That's where our bedrock principles come from. Yes. I'll give another example of this. The textbook that I used in undergrad to teach, economic principles. In the beginning, the first chapter, it said how to think like an economist, and it had a bunch of principles, and it was stuff like, there's always scarcity, there's always trade-offs, every choice has an opportunity cost, things like that. People make decisions on the market. And then one of them was, to be scientific, economic theories have to be testable. And so I was saying to the class why I said, yeah, I like all these other ones. This one, I think they just threw in there. And actually, I don't agree with that, but it's in the book. So let me just talk about blah, blah, blah. Right. And one of my students had a great insight, and he raised his hand. And he said, and also notice that all those other principles about how to think like an economist are not testable. And he was right. That was a good indication. Because so in case your viewers don't get the point, like to say, one of the principles was people respond to incentives. And that's actually not testable, because look, I could say, Robert, I'll give you, a Satoshi if you chop off your left arm, and you'll say, no, thanks. Did I just falsify the claim that people respond to incentives? No, I would just say, oh, the incentive wasn't high enough. Yeah. Right. So that's the thing. It's to say people respond to incentives, and that's how economists think. Really, what you're just saying is economists have decided that's how we're going to view the world. Yes. That's the framework, the lens we're going to use. You actually don't go test, you don't test does supply and demand exist? No, that's just a category, a concept we're going to use to go look at the world. So maybe in some settings it's not helpful. Sometimes people analyze the dating market using economics, and that kind of creeps me out. But it's not that it's false or true. The way you could say, is certain interpretations of quantum physics, is that true or false? And you'd say, well, I don't know, let's go run the experiment. Right. But I'm saying a lot of the stuff in economics, it's more a framework that you're using. And so the Keynesians, and even just regular, what we call neoclassicals that aren't necessarily Keynesian, I think they're fooling themselves. They think they're being real rigorous, but actually they're, for one thing, they can't predict as well as the quantum physicists can, right? What's going to happen in a 2-slit experiment or something, they know very well, even though it's kind of crazy, it doesn't make any sense, the words they use to describe what's going on. But the predictions are borne out. Whereas in economics right now, mainstream economics, they have no clue what GDP is going to be next quarter. Right. So on their own terms, they're not very scientific, or the economic science is not very good. Yes.
So that's a really important point, that there are, I guess you'd say there's no constants in human action, which distinguishes it from something like physics, where we know water is going to freeze at 0 degrees Celsius every time and everywhere for all intents and purposes. And the other thing is, you can't isolate variables in economics, where we talk about running the experiment. You can control certain variables, test others. You can't do that in an economic setting, because it's, not controllable. So the fact that you can't control for any of the variables means that you can't isolate them. So you cannot establish, you can't test these axioms. So you're creating an axiomatic framing almost. So they're presuppositions through which you decide to view the world, and then you can look at economic history to see if they fit the data. So the free trade example you gave, you could then look at the Hong Kong miracle or whatever it was and say, oh, this is an example of free trade. We had low and predictable taxes. We had a lot of trade. The city exploded in wealth. Right, that would be related to this free trade axiom. And this is tricky, because I don't think that's why the geometry example is so useful. I think that's one of the few examples that we are familiar with of this way of thinking. Maybe logic to some extent. Logic's deductive as well, but most people aren't super familiar with that type of training. Maybe we could proceed now to another term. I'll just have you define this, and we can talk about it a little bit. This is one I had never even heard of before reading Human Action. Praxeology. What is this term? Did Mises originate this term, and what is the proper way to think about how it fits into, I guess rather to say how economics fits into praxeology?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the term itself, I think the best direct definition of it would be the science of human action. Okay. And it's in terms of the etymology, the the term praxis, I think, means action. And so, ology is the study of, like geology is the study of the earth and, that kind of stuff. So theology is study of theism, God. So praxeology is the scientific, or just this, the formal study of action per se. And so, so the way Mises explains what happened is he said, originally the what we call the classical economists, people like David Ricardo and Adam Smith, and Karl Marx, they had a labor or a cost theory of value. And so the way they explained market prices was by like, the reason that stagecoach trades for this many bushels of wheat in the marketplace, they have comparable market values, is because the amount of labor power that goes into producing that many bushels of wheat is also the same amount of labor power that goes into the, stagecoach. So that was the way they thought about it. And there is a certain logic to that in certain settings, especially for reproducible goods. And if you're talking about the long run average price, that is tends to be true. But you can come up with all sorts of counter examples. You're just wandering in the woods and you find some stagecoach that was there and you have no idea how many hours went into it. When you take it into market, you're going to be able to sell it and you're not going to give it away for free. Right. And people aren't going to say, well, how can we price this thing because we don't know its history? No, people can evaluate it. And so, so that was what's called the subjective marginal revolution that occurred in the 1870s, where three independent people came up with it, one of whom was Karl Menger in the book that's now labeled The Founding of the Austrian School. So what they replaced that old classical cost or labor theory of value with the modern subjective marginal utility approach that said ultimately value is a subjective thing. It's in the mind of the beholder. And then, once you understand how consumers value a bottle of wine, then you can understand why the grapes get value because you use grapes to make the wine. And so it reversed the causality. Instead of the inputs giving value to the output, it's the other way around. That subjective utility explains the consumer goods, and then that works the other way to explain the prices of the inputs that make them.
Right.
So Mises says that this wasn't just a mere, change in the technique for explaining market prices, that once you brought open, once you had to use subjective valuation for this sort of mundane task of just explaining market prices, that kind of opened up a whole new field. Like it didn't just stop there, because then you realize the way you formally or scientifically, if you will, talk about how people value goods in the marketplace in order to understand the marginal utility. And why is it that 3 apples end up trading for 2 oranges? The techniques or the methods you would use to explain that doesn't just stop for economic things. Once you have to explain human action in a market setting, then now you've actually the tools you've developed explain just human action per se. And so that's why Mises says really this founded this new field of praxeology, the formal or scientific study of action per se. And then one subset in praxeology is what he called catalactics, or the science of exchanges. So it's like so human action is just any purposive behavior. When you rationally use means to achieve an end, that's action in the Misesian sense of that term. And then a subset of that is, market action.
Right. So human action is distinguished from reflexive action, where I think the example you give is when the doctor hits your knee with a little hammer and your leg kicks out. That's not purposive pursuit of, means towards ends. So that's technically in the Mises sense, not human action, right? It's just reflexive.
Right. And the only quibble I would have is you said reflexive action. He wouldn't use the term action. So he would just say it's reflexive behavior.
Reflexive behavior.
It's, it's human behavior, like your body's doing stuff. But when the doctor hits your kneecap and your leg goes up, that's not action.
Right.
If the doctor insults you and you raise your leg to kick him, that's action.
Yes. So it's almost as if the human beings were looking out upon the world and assigning different things as means towards ends. right? We're trying to utilize nature or relationships, anything we can control or affect or influence. We're trying to use those to achieve ends, and that is praxeology broader. And then the economic subset of that would just be when we're actually using exchange to achieve ends. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty good. So again, I'll just say it in different words.
Mm-hmm.
So right, the praxeology is you're adopting this stance of interpreting certain observations, things you're seeing in the world. You're assuming that there is a conscious mind at work, right? So if someone takes a rock and throws it, and and it goes in a roughly a parabola, like there's air friction and stuff, but it goes up and comes down. We don't say, oh, the rock originally wanted to get away from the ground, but then changed its mind, and we just don't talk like that, right? Yeah. That's not the way we describe things now, in terms of the material world. That would be considered unscientific. Yeah. But if we see a plane take off and it goes up and then it turns around and comes back down, you might say, oh, the pilot wanted to leave, but then forgot, some important bit of luggage, and so changed his mind and landed. Yes. It's not unscientific to talk like that. And in fact, that's a very good explanation for what the heck just happened. Right. So we assume there's a conscious mind at work that has goals and is using a means to achieve. Or you see somebody, you see this, and you try to explain what just happened, and you'll say, oh, apparently Bob was thirsty, or, whatever, he needed a jolt of caffeine, and so he took a sip. And so if you unpack that, there's actually a lot built into that.
Yes.
That you assume I have goals, and you're assuming that I believe drinking that liquid will help quench it. You see what I mean? So it's actually pretty sophisticated. And that's what I mean, that just the concept of human action itself actually has embedded in it all sorts of implications if you just think through them.
Right.
Because you also said, oh, I must have decided the benefits of drinking that outweighed the costs.
Yes.
There's lots of like economic-y things that are packed into just your decision to interpret what I just did as action.
Yes.
If I'm sitting here and the ceiling caves in and takes me out, you would just say, oh, there was an earthquake, or you know what I mean? You wouldn't say, oh, Bob decided that he wanted the ceiling to cave in on his head, or you know what I mean? Like that's not the way you would talk. Or you wouldn't say the ceiling decided that it had had enough of this conversation and the interview was over. You wouldn't talk like that, because you wouldn't assume you see what I mean? So I'm saying the reason I'm dwelling on it is because we do it so casually and automatically in everyday life that we sort of take it for granted.
Right.
But Mises, was stressing that. And then like you were saying, that once you have that stance, then physical things in the real world become imbued with our motives. So like this thing right here, you might say, oh, that's a writing instrument. But if I took it and stabbed somebody in the neck with it, it becomes a weapon.
Right.
It's the same physical thing. It's just, but if I'm walking and I just trip and happen to accidentally, it's not so much that it was a weapon. It was a pen, a writing instrument, is a freak accident. So like my intention changes how we classify this physical thing. So there's lots of stuff like that again, a lot of economists who don't subscribe to the Austrian approach are like, well, this is just silly word games. This is whatever. You're, the college kids doing bong hits and they sit around and pontificate. But other people think, no, this is really deep stuff, and let's really think about what we're doing before we jump into the economics.
Yeah, the way I like to describe it to some people is that it sort of shatters the materialist viewpoint on reality, where we just think things are intrinsically what they are, when in fact it's these cross currents of intentionality from conscious actors that are transforming things, right? Like this table that's holding my computer is an accessory to me, but if I pay someone to jump over it, then it becomes an obstacle to them, and things are constantly transforming based on this confluence of different market actor aims. I don't know if you would say just market actor, just conscious actor aims. And it's interesting. Yeah, there's almost like this lattice overlaid on the world that we don't see. It kind of gets into Bastiat's seen and unseen, or maybe he's actually repurposed that from someone else. But there's this, and I think this makes economics so difficult to understand, is that it's an unseen territory, right? Where he gives the example of, the broken window. Oh, you go and break the window. You've created a job for a glazier to come and fix the new window. The economy's been improved. That's what you see, but the unseen is the guy that had to pay for the broken window, the suit he would have bought had he not had to fix the window. So it's very interesting. It's almost like this invisible, I think of it, if you're in like the casino and you're sitting around a table, like there's not a lot of actual events happening. You know, it's just a few little pieces of paper and cards and chips moving around, but there's this very powerful, silent contention of willpower at the table where people are trying to figure out one another's moves. And that's kind of like a microcosm of what the market economy is at a larger scale. So that gets maybe into teleology in a bit. Is that what is? So praxeology, the study of action, is then observing the output of teleology. Is that the way to think about it properly?
Right. So yeah, teleology is like ascribing purpose or intention to something, and like this formal study of that. So right. So you wouldn't have. So for example, like where people often try to discourage that is in biology, right? When you're talking about evolution and students learn that, you know, they often slip and say things, you know, like, oh, and the creature evolved, you know, because they wanted to be able to climb the mountain better. And so that's why they evolved, you know, and sometimes, you know, the professor will say, no, it's not that evolution has any goal, you know, it's just blah, 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 you know, so that's, and so, but yes, in economics and certainly praxeology, that's, you know, job number one, that's literally the foundation of praxeology, is that when you say, you know, the action axiom to say that there is human action, and that's where we're starting from, you are that term action, like I said, to distinguish it from just reflexive behavior means there is a mind at work, or if you want to be more modest in the claim, to say we are going to proceed as if there's a mind at work, because I guess technically we don't know.
Right.
We could be in the matrix, although that begs the question, you know, who designed the matrix? But right. So it certainly seems like to us, and that's what's neat too about this. It kind of circles back to the empirical thing. If you say, you know, why is it like, what's the benefit? Why do you use praxeology? You would say, well, because this gives us better results. I can navigate the world better if I adopt the working hypothesis that there are other minds at work, at least in things that look like me. Like I don't necessarily need to think that that building is alive, or that the sun is alive. But you know, if these other, you know, bags of protein and whatever they're walking around in water, that I ascribe an ego to that thing, and it has goals and whatever, and you know that just helps me achieve what I want to do better than if I literally thought I was the only mind on Earth. Like you just would not, you wouldn't achieve your own ends as well as effectively if you actually were a solipsist.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, I don't want to say provable, but it's obvious if you treat someone that way. If you treat someone like they have no mind or no agency or no sovereignty, you just say, you know, you're this, you're that, do this, do that. Like people, we resent that. We hate that. So it's kind of like probably similar to a useful fiction in a way, where it's like you always treat every gun as if it's loaded. It doesn't mean that you actually, you don't even need to know whether the gun is loaded or not, but you should always treat it that way, as a useful way of being. And the same way you should treat everyone as if they are a conscious agent. It's kind of a useful way of being.
Right. And to make sure people aren't so it's, you know, because you were talking about sovereignty and stuff, but even like if you said like, no, I go and kidnap people and keep them in my basement and whatever, because I'm a sick, sadistic guy. But I say to them things like, you know, I'll feed you or whatever, but if I ever hear anybody screaming, then I'm going to shoot you in the kneecaps. The mere fact that I'm threatening them shows that I think they have minds and they have goals. And I think, I bet you they don't want to have extreme pain. So even there, I am using praxeology. You know, I'm violating property rights and natural law and all sorts of, you know, Christian ethics. But the point being, even there, if you start bargaining or threatening people, you are treating them as if they have goals themselves and they have reason. Right. You know, it's sort of like you were mentioning, we both have kids that when they're real young and they're screaming or whatever, you can't even bargain with them. Like you want them to get old enough so maybe you can bribe them, if you know what I mean? Like, you know, you don't even have the option of saying, I'll give you this candy bar if you shut up. If they don't understand language, you know?
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. I never thought about it from that direction, but Yeah, to be competent or effective in the world, you have to make that presupposition in both instances, good or bad scenario.
Right. And also too, even people who pretend like an extreme behaviorist, BF Skinner and the people in that school, I guarantee you they didn't go through life not thinking, you know what I mean? Like they knew, I'm sure, when they left the office and then went, they behaved normally. Just like, this isn't the exact same example, but people would say stuff like, I'm sure you've heard this, that, because we ultimately know people really don't have free will. They've just been conditioned and, they don't choose. That's why it would be inhumane to lock them up for committing a crime.
Uh-huh.
But they're not being consistent. So, okay, well, I've been conditioned to lock people up when they murder someone. Right. So it's silly for you to use words on me and try to convince me and appeal to my sense of, I have no free will. I have no choice but to vote for a politician who wants to lock them up.
Yeah.
So you see what I mean? Even there, they're applying it just in one little area and then trying to talk to us and persuade us because they're treating us like we have free will in this conversation.
Right. So, it's not consistent. That's interesting. Wow. So that maybe gets into this domain of preferences, I guess. So you have these varying purposes or intentions being expressed through human action, often in the marketplace. And this is closely related to value. So I guess you could talk about either if you like, but my understanding is that essentially all human action is an expression of value or preference, and that we have this kind of rank ordered list of next actions to take, and whatever we're doing in that moment, we're expressing the preference for that action over all other options. But this was kind of a breakthrough in the economic science where we figured out value was ordinal, and this got us past the cardinal value of was it utility, I believe, that they thought in terms of prior to that. I might be messing some of this up, but maybe you could just speak to the ordinal versus cardinal preferences and value.
Yeah, so everything you said is correct. So you didn't mess anything up, but yeah, just to elaborate on that. So originally, like Aristotle, going back that far, when they were again trying to explain market value, why is it that goods possess different quantities of value in the marketplace? Why is it that a bushel of wheat trades for so many bushels of something else or whatever? Mm-hmm. So Aristotle thought there must be something equal in both things, right? That again, the stagecoach trades for so many bushels of wheat. The fact that they trade means they have equal market value in that moment. The things being swapped have equal market value. And so there must be something in them. So it's obviously not like the number of wheels or the number of fibers or something, because those are different. Mm-hmm. But that was wrong, or at least that was a dead end. There wasn't very productive because that really couldn't explain too much. And so again, the fundamental insight in the 1870s marginal revolution was to say, actually, when there's a trade, it doesn't show equality. It shows an inequality of subjective value. Mm-hmm. That the person who gives up the stagecoach for the wheat values the wheat on the margin, those units of wheat, more than that particular unit of stagecoach, and vice versa. The other person valued the stagecoach more. Mm-hmm. So actually there's an equality in the market valuation, but in terms of what's explaining that and driving that exchange, there's an inequality in the subjective valuations. Mm-hmm. And because it's a subjective thing, there's no contradiction. So another way of putting it is both parties could walk away thinking they got the more valuable item. Right. That's not it. Whereas they can't both walk away getting the more massive item, or the item, that has the most iron in it or something. One would have to be wrong, right? Because that's an objective feature of the object. Yes. And they can't both be more massive than the other. Okay. But they could both be more valuable if you're allowing there to be different minds at work. So that's the fundamental insight. And so then early, like even you see it in Menger and Böhm-Bawerk, who's like the second generation Austrians, they thought that subjective valuation was this measurable quantity of like happiness or utility or satisfaction. And that's kind of how they would explain it. Like, so the reason the stagecoach trades for 10 bushels of wheat is that, the stagecoach has 100 utils and each bushel of wheat has 10 utils. And that's why, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was later, though, that economists realized you could explain everything just by having what's called ordinal rankings. So you didn't need to assign a cardinal number. And I'll explain in a second those terms. Yeah. But it was more just, you need to rank things like first, second best, third best, fourth best. And if you could just do things like that, you could explain everything we need to in economics. You didn't have to say the first orange gives me 87 utils, the second orange gives me 80 utils, and so on. You didn't have to talk like that. You could just say you could rank stuff.
Yeah.
So an analogy I use to try to get it, because it does sound cumbersome at first, is like with friendship. And so say it makes sense to say, who's your best friend? Oh, Jim's my best. Who's your second best friend? Mary. Who's my third best friend? Sally. But you wouldn't say how much more of a friend is Jim than Mary. Is he like 60% more of a friend? Like quantify the friendship units you have. Like you might say, no, that doesn't really make sense, but it does make sense to say Jim is a better friend than Mary, right? And so I'm saying in economics, they realized, like in the early 1900s, I think, that everything they do in consumer theory and all the, the stuff, the way we explain market prices and everything using this cardinal notion of utility, because a cardinal number is like a regular number, like people think 87.3 or something. So cardinal numbers, you could do operations on it. It makes sense to say what's 10% of that. Whereas ordinal numbers are things like first, second, third, 87th. So it doesn't make sense to say what's 10% of second.
Right.
It's not 0.2th. That's not how it works. It doesn't make any sense. Right. So, or you wouldn't say what's third plus fourth. That doesn't equal seventh. Yeah. It's so you can't do operations on ordinal things. And so, like I say, in economics, they purged it of the cardinality because they realized we can do it. And Mises thought that wasn't just like an elegant trick. It wasn't just like Occam's razor or something. It wasn't just like, hey, get rid of what we don't need.
Right.
He thought that makes sense because ultimately, we're grounding it on action. What do you do in action is you choose one thing and set aside the alternative.
Yes.
So in action, you're illustrating, I prefer A to B. All we can really say is A gave you more utility than B, or you preferred A to B by the choice.
Yes.
You couldn't say you preferred A 87% more than B because all you're doing is choosing one versus the other. So since all action is just choice, a binary thing between the thing you chose and then the next best alternative, that's why he thought, yes, that preference, by its very nature is an ordinal ranking of alternatives.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it is very different, just a different way of thinking. And it's amazing how much work must have gone into that. It's like, because it seems like you would just apply that sort of materialist, scientific, objectifiable viewpoint to things where you have these units of utils or whatever you may describe. But to realize that you don't need that because it's not relevant, that just blows my mind. I think it's very interesting. Tell me, so I think about this too. You have the inequality of exchange driving exchange. So you think what I'm giving you is more valuable and vice versa. So we both perceive like we're gaining value in the trade. That's what's driving all exchange. But then a neutral third party observing that exchange would equate the two effectively, right? They'd say they have the same market price if they both cleared at that price. So is that at the heart of value creation? Because we're both receiving more perceived value. And then the third party is where price is trying to map to value. I think Mises may call this an appraisal versus evaluation. Is that correct thinking?
Yes, you're right. This does get really tricky. So certainly, yes, what you can say is every voluntary exchange makes the participants better off in their own mind, at least ex ante. So that's just a fancy term meaning like ahead of time going into it. Like, so ex post, they might regret it. Yes. But if it truly is voluntary, then, the reason they agreed to it was because they thought that would make them better off. And also too, I should stress, this is a very broad notion of better off. Like you might give up the candy bar for some spinach, even though in a sense, I like the candy bar better, but it's like, well, no, there must be a sense in which you really did prefer the spinach, because otherwise, why did you make the trade?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's, it can be your higher self or whatever, however you want to talk about it. But ultimately, if it is voluntary and you agree to the exchange, it must be because you prefer what you're receiving to what you gave up.
Yeah.
So yes, there is a sense in which, do you want to call that value creation? I'm okay using that terminology if you want, because it means you transform the items in your possession into ones you value more.
Right.
So, if value creation means anything, then that would be an example of it. I'll put it that way. But you're right. It does get tricky, because then when you say, well, where do market prices come from, and how do we ascribe objective market values to things or measure wealth?
Yeah.
Then you use exchanges to come up with, just like to say, well, what's the market cap of this company? You say, well, what's the latest stock price? And what you really mean is the last time someone traded dollars or whatever currency you're using for a share of this corporate stock, what was the price per share? And then that's what we're going to use to then multiply and say, okay, so that's what we mean by the market cap. So yes, you are using voluntary trades, even though, like we say, both sides of that trade had an unequal valuations. That's why they did the trade.
Right.
You're not just going to go on trading for things that you think are of equal value, because then what's the point of doing that?
You'd never trade. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so but there is a sense in which you say, because someone valued the corporate stock, the share, more than the $50, and because the seller valued the $50 more than the corporate stock, now we're going to say that stock is worth $50.
Right.
Right. And so, but again, we got to know, what do we mean by that? And it doesn't actually mean the utility of $50, or the utility you get from $50 is the same as the utility you get from the corporate stock. That's actually not what it means.
Right.
In fact, people keep buying and selling and adjusting their holdings of cash and corporates, that company's shared stock, until there is no more gain.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, you keep buying shares, if you get more utility from the next share of that corporate stock at $50, you would keep buying more and more. And then at some point you stop. So actually it explains why everyone doesn't just have all their wealth consisting of one asset.
Right.
Right. So the idea of making decisions on the margin.
Right.
This actually, this new approach explains stuff like that. Or you go into the grocery store and you see hot dogs are, $2 a pack. You say, oh, that's a good deal. You don't go sell your house to buy as many, right? At some point you stop, because when you say that's a good, what you mean is the first or the second pack of hot dogs I get is more valuable to me than the $10th bill or the $8th bill. Right. At some point on the margin, no, another pack of hot dogs is not worth more to me than the $2 I would have to give up.
Yes. Does that get us into the marginal utility? Was it a revolution or have we come back to this ordinal versus cardinal thing, or are those unrelated?
They are related. And so, yes, what I just said is using marginal utility. That's the point. That was the revolution. They call it the marginal revolution. Okay. So it's actually, I personally call it the subjective marginal revolution, because I think it's the objective subjective is an important part of what actually changed. Yes. To say, oh no, it's in people's minds. It's not the intrinsic features of the object. Value resides in your mind, not in the object. But it's actually called, it went down in history as the marginal revolution for what I just said. That a different example, you might have heard the so-called water diamond paradox. And so the idea is they knew that goods somehow derive their market value from their ability to satisfy human wants, right? Like they knew, human beings had to have something to do with why certain things were valuable in the marketplace. But there appeared to be a conundrum. Water is essential for life. So how come water, how come a gallon of water or a kilogram or whatever of water doesn't have a much higher price than a kilogram of diamonds? Because diamonds are pretty to look at, but you could take them or leave them. It's not going to, but whereas if the water's gone, then we're all dead. Yeah. So you would think if the market value of commodities is somehow related to their ability to help humans or to do things humans want, that water should be really expensive and diamonds shouldn't be, but yet it's the opposite. And the solution there is thinking in terms of the margin, that because in most settings we have more water than we need to satisfy most of our urgent desires, on the margin, that last gallon of water really isn't very valuable. You take 1 gallon of water away, doesn't affect my life.
Right.
Whereas you give me an extra gallon of diamonds, that really changes my life.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why I would pay a lot more for a gallon of diamonds than a gallon of water. In most settings, if you're starving or dying of thirst in the desert, it would flip. You don't care about a diamond. You see, a bucket of water, you're going to be excited. So that's the marginal revolution. And so then, in terms of the ordinal cardinal, it's related in the sense that the way we explain it now, we start with just ordinal preference rankings to explain, how it is that the first unit is really valued, the second unit not as much, and the successive unit. So that's why, if really what you're talking about is the 10,000th unit of water on the margin, it's not very valuable. So you're using an ordinal framework to talk about that, but you could believe in cardinal utility and also do the marginal approach. And historically, that is what they did. Like I said, Menger and Bavaric, when they were first fleshing this stuff out, they did have examples where they were thinking in terms of utils and people assigning numbers to say, oh, that seventh apple gives me 87 units of happiness or something.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. So it's like the more sophisticated the market economy, or I guess you could say the deeper the division of labor, the more likely we are to make these things that are very fundamental abundant, because there's a lot of demand. Well, let's see. I was just saying that water, clearly something very essential for human life. We will produce a lot of it because there's a lot of demand for it to the best of our ability. And then the residual of that economic process tends to flow into lower utility things like diamonds or gold or whatever. But if you then took that same person and put them on a desert island, the value of diamonds and gold would just collapse to its utility value in a way. So what I was trying to get at there is, it seems like almost money or store of value assets, it is this excess productivity we're creating through the division of labor. So the more deeply we divide it, the more of that claim on productivity. I don't know if productivity is the right term here. That residual economization is then put into other assets that store it better, which would be like a gold or diamond, something like that. Is that, am I thinking along correct lines there?
I mean, I think I agree with what you said. I've never thought of it in those terms before. So, I mean, it's certainly true that humans would first, direct their productive efforts to satisfying the most urgent needs.
Mm-hmm.
So like, water, food, things like that. And then once those are satisfied, then they would, direct them to other ones. And it's also true that as the economy develops and things get more mature, there becomes a role for a medium of exchange, and then certain goods have better properties or are more suited to that, and that those aren't necessarily the same things that would make it like, something essential for life.
Mm-hmm.
And that, the way you would explain, like, why is it that gold and silver historically were the commodity monies of choice and not cattle or water, even though you might think, oh, but everybody needs to eat and everybody needs to drink water. Just as you say, because of the scarcity element, that's one of the main differentiators.
Yeah, it's interesting. It feels like so what is the right term here? It's the division of labor is creating more excess, I want to say economic energy or productivity, and that, or maybe you could even call it a monetary premium in a way, where the excess value being created through economization, it needs to be stored somewhere, and it typically gets stored in money on a free market. I'm not talking about fiat currency. What is that term for the economic energy or productivity?
I'm trying to think. So I actually don't know in terms of the Austrian school, if they have a term for the, here's the difficulty, because there's really not a hard and fast or sharp distinction between like, producing for like the basic needs, and then once those are satisfied, switching it's more of a gradation. And in certain settings, like some religious monk or something might prefer to, I want to look at this. I want to see this Bible completed and just read it one last time before I die of hunger or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and so if he had the choice, he would spend his last money on getting the Bible to read before he expires and passes out. So, I mean, ultimately, when you have subjective value and just try to explain human action, you can't come up with a lot of rules about this is how people behave, or this is how people act.
Yeah.
Because they could, they're pretty unpredictable. They can do all kinds of stuff. So, there's that element involved. So again, certainly, I'm trying to think. There's other, like this Italian economist Piero Sraffa. He had a thing where he wrote in Italian. I'm trying to think of what the translation would be, but something like excess production or surplus production. So certainly in the Marxist framework, there's like a surplus value that's right. Where that's the source of profit in a capitalist system, according to Marx, is that the workers produce more than they need for their bare sustenance. And so that's right. Where this excess comes from, the same with Sraffa. Like that's how a slave economy works. Right. If the slaves could only pick enough food and whatever to just replace their clothes as they get worn out and to maintain themselves physically, there'd be no point to owning slaves, right? You need it that they can produce more than they need themselves. And like I say, different frameworks have different terms, but actually now that I'm thinking of it, I don't think the Austrians do. And I think partly it's because they're so subjective that they're going to say there's no hard and fast distinction between like, what do you need versus what's extra.
Maybe this is related to the emergence of money then on the free market. And I guess this gets into some of Menger's work. I think he wrote on the origins of money. So then we're initially producing commodities that have utility to us. But as we begin to trade with one another as a means of increasing our economic efficiency through the division of labor, certain goods start to develop a marketability premium, which is independent of their utility to us. And then whatever develops the greatest marketability premium is then money. Is that correct? And it maybe then the things you're holding that have the marketability premium is kind of like the storehold of that excess economic energy, or whatever term that I don't have.
Sure. So yeah, I agree with everything up to that last one. And then the last one, I'll explain a little bit about, just to be careful with that concept. So yeah, you're right. Menger, he, in addition to, founding the Austrian school, he's also, he didn't invent this idea like you can see in Adam Smith. So Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1776, Menger's book is 1871, just for people who have the timeline. But yeah, Menger later wrote, I think it was like in an encyclopedia of economics, the entry on the origin of money, right? So that's why it's not just Austrians, liking him because he's their guy, but he really was given this task in terms of the history of economic thought. So the way he explained it is, he said, first of all, people tend to think that if there's some great social innovation that some wise ruler or priest or somebody must have invented it and had the idea. But he said, actually, money is so weird when you think about it that, we're going to, if people were just doing direct exchange or barter, that if somebody said, hey, I know, instead of directly trading things that you want yourself, why don't you sell the things to others in exchange for something that you actually don't want? But don't worry, because everyone else is going to do that too. If we can all agree to do this, then you can go get the things you want, because they'll give you that thing and you give them the thing that nobody wants. Like these shells. Let's use these shells and we'll call it money. People would think you were nuts. That sounds like the stupidest thing ever, right? Like, why would we do that? Yeah. And so, because it sounds like it won't work too. Like, what if I don't trust other people are going to do it? Then I'm going to be the sucker with these shells and no one's going to want them, right? And so, and people in the crypto space actually can be like, yeah, some of these new coins, I know what you're talking about, right? But it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, where if we could all agree to do it, it would be great. But if I'm the only one who does it, then it's not going to work well. Yeah. So Menger was saying that's probably not how money originated, right? And so we have to explain the emergence of money as like a spontaneous order, like a step-by-step thing that nobody set out to invent it. It just kind of happened naturally, as it were. But clearly it has to do with human action, right? It's not like looking at trees and say nobody invented a tree. Like money clearly is a human creation, but yet he was pointing. So anyway, so the way he described is, like you said, imagine your original, barter economy. Certain goods would be more marketable, like eggs have a wider market than telescopes. More people. If you go to market with eggs, you're more likely to find somebody who has what you need than if you go to market with a telescope.
Right.
And so that's why if you did happen to have a telescope and you saw someone with eggs who wanted a telescope, even if you were trying to go get leather boots, you would probably make that trade, because the chance of me finding someone with leather boots who wants eggs is higher than finding someone who has leather boots and wants a telescope. So I'm going to unload this telescope for eggs because the eggs are more marketable, or they're more liquid. And then, so you see the things that were initially more marketable, their marketability gets enhanced because of that second order effect, where people accept it just because they know this is more marketable. They don't want it themselves. It's like there's a famous example in a POW camp in World War II. Cigarettes became the currency. So even non-smokers would give up, if you had an extra ration of ham and you didn't like it, you would sell it for some cigarettes, even if you weren't a smoker,
right? Because
there were enough smokers who really wanted cigarettes that you could get whatever you needed if you had cigarettes. Right. So that was Menger's insight. And that's where money came from. Once one or two commodities were accepted, that process would snowball. And then once a few commodities were just accepted by just about everybody, that's what money is.
Right.
So then my only concern with what you were saying about like the energy in the system or something getting pumped is, again, that it almost sounds like, there's physical things going into the objects. And so I would just, again, caution that everything's ultimately in our minds, and what something is money because of what we're doing with it, and it has value because of what our minds are ascribing to it.
Right. Yes.
And, its value could disappear tomorrow.
It's expectation based, not actual energy going into a battery that you can spend. Yes. No, that's fair criticism there. It's funny you give that example of the POW camp. I grew up playing this massive online multiplayer game called Diablo 2. And it had it's like a live Dungeons and Dragons type game, but it also had trade channels where you'd go and trade these items with other players. And it had its own emergent currency. There was no currency. There was currency in the game, but the supply was so large that it didn't have a lot of value to the items. So these little rings called Stone of Jordan rings became the de facto currency in the game. And just no one set out to do that. The game designer didn't do it. No individual player did. It just happened. So I think it makes all the sense in the world that if you have a market economy, something's just going to become the most marketable good. And that would clearly be preferred by all market actors to satisfy their aims. So.
Yeah, that's great. And I had seen some stuff, I was like 10 years ago, but some economists had really started studying those, what is it, like MM? I forget the letters are, but massive multiplayer online role-playing games, or whatever, MMORPG or something. Yeah. And because of the economic implications of it, it was almost like this almost perfect simulated environment where we can try all sorts of stuff, at low cost. And my understanding is, some of the world, I don't know if it was Diablo, but there was something where it was like, because like the way it originally worked was if you went out and killed monsters, like they would have gold coins on them. Yeah. But then some people were just like paying kids in India to play their game for them while they slept or went to work. And then so there was like inflation. Yeah. And so like the sword, like the price of the swords and stuff quoted in gold pieces just kept going up and up and up. And so finally they had to change the settings that, there couldn't be this constant influx of new coins from computer generated monsters. So anyway, there was a lot of neat stuff like that where economists who weren't playing these games were like, this is kind of like a cool laboratory. Let's start studying this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. We went through a number of those episodes too, where people figured out how to duplicate items and whatnot. So we saw inflation happen in real time. It was interesting to learn. I had no idea I was learning economics at the time. I was just a kid, but just to reflect on it, it's funny. So this is kind of rewinding a bit back to Mises' view on human action. So he makes this distinction between a priori and a posteriori, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And maybe this is also related to apodictic. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word. I think that's just another way of saying a priori. Could you describe the difference between those for the audience? Because I think this is very critical to understanding not just economics, but really epistemology and philosophy more generally.
Right. So a priori is things you can know. The mnemonic I use is just like this, the word prior is kind of embedded in there. And so it's, like things you can know just by thinking through. Like you don't have to go look out in the world to see whether they're true or not. Whereas a posteriori, again, the mnemonic I use is like there's post in there, like after the fact. Yeah. And so, a posteriori, you have to go observe the world to see, to learn about this. Yeah. So, and you're right, in epistemology, the study of knowledge, how do we come to know things? These are terms like that Kant used a lot, and then I think that's where Mises picked this up from. And there's the other two are analytic and synthetic, and so those are like, so there's like four quadrants. You have synthetic a priori, analytic a priori, a posteriori, synthetic a posteriori, and analytic a posteriori. And then and people argue about whether like synthetic a priori is an empty set or not. Okay. So, what Mises was arguing is that economic science, like the laws of economics or principles of economics, are a priori. And he's saying those are things we can know just through introspection, just thinking about, you don't need to go test it, just like geometry is, right? Going back to that earlier discussion we had, that the way you establish geometric theorems is you just state the axioms, you come up with a deduction, you go through the proof. If you think it's wrong, you have to show me at what step in the chain of reasoning that I make, a deduction that actually wasn't valid. It's not that you go out in the world and test this theory, because that's misunderstanding what you just did. Right. Whereas to say, is Einstein's theory of general relativity, is that true or not? You can't just use introspection. You have to go test and see, like, well, what happens to Mercury in its orbit? Does it actually do what Einstein said, or does it do what Newton said? That kind of stuff. Right. And so, so physics would be an a posteriori science, whereas Mises would say economics is a priori. And then that term apodictic just means like beyond dispute. So yes, if something is a priori and you agree with the deduction, then the result is apodictic. Beyond dispute. So that's why, so that's why Mises, uses that term sometimes.
Gotcha. One of the things I was, again, rereading a little bit of Human Action recently, and he makes this point that I think it's that a priori assertions are irrational, actually, versus anything a posteriori is rational. And maybe this is the axioms themselves are irrational. And I think he means by this that you can't, perhaps what you're saying right here is you can't rationally go out and test it necessarily. It's just deduced. Whereas everything that is deduced can then be tested in the real world. So therefore it's rational. Have I muddied terms there, or is it?
Okay. So and this is how you know that up till now, when I've been saying, yep, that's right, that I wasn't just coddling you, because here I'm going to say that doesn't sound right to me. Like, okay. I'm not sure what could be. I mean, what you might have in mind is, I think he does say something like, the ultimate
givens, I think.
Right. The ultimate givens are not things subject to testing.
Yes.
So I don't think he would say they're irrational, because that means like they violate reason. I think he might just say maybe he said they're irrational, or
okay.
It could be something like, so like I said, I don't remember what passage you have in mind, but yes.
I think I could imagine non-rational. So that would be irrational, like you're describing. Okay.
Right. So so here, because irrational, has the connotation of that it's against reason, and he certainly thinks a priori truth is is reasonable, is consistent with reason.
Yes.
But you're right. He could say the ultimate givens are things that we just accept, and like people act. And
yes.
By the way, on that, Israel Kirzner one time told me, so Kirzner had studied under Mises at NYU, and then I went to NYU when Kirzner was still there. And he mentioned to me in passing that he once asked Mises, how do we know that people act? And that Mises said, through observation. So, so it's kind of an interesting thing. So take what you will from that. You know what I mean? Like, it's an interesting, because people might have thought he would say, well, because, you're sitting in a closet and realize I'm going to just assume people. And
right.
No, and that kind of circles back to what we were saying, Robert, about you just navigate the world better if you assume for the sake of argument that there are other minds at work, whether, you could never really know that in a fundamental sense, but still, come on. That's what you do when you're dealing with other people, is you assume they have inner thoughts like you do.
Yes. So yeah, that's very interesting, but there is a leap of faith associated with it, right? You have to choose an axiomatic framing for being and thinking, I guess, even. But that's so interesting.
Yeah, and if you encountered someone too that was like, you might say, oh, they've been brainwashed or they're sleepwalking, and so maybe then you would put more of a box around them and say they're not, acting in a true sense. They're more like reflexive behavior at the moment or something. So
right.
But yeah, in general, in our social interactions, of course, we are assuming there's other minds at work and they have goals that might be different from ours.
Yes. It's interesting to me, though, that there is that fundamental kernel. I'll use the word faith. I think Mises would say all action is speculative, right? Where we can't know what's going to happen. We just have to actually assume, I guess, or take this little leap of faith. I think it's interesting that underpins, or perhaps even is inherent to these axioms on which we build all of these other knowledge structures. I don't know, for my intuition there is that somehow the religious text and mythology is alluding to that often, the act of faith or whatever. Maybe it's not just some benign belief in a deity. It's actually talking about, praxis in some interesting way.
It's also in Kung Fu Panda. I just watched that the other day, where the big thing the turtle gives, he says, you must believe, like that's the important thing.
That's right. My daughter loves that movie. It's a great movie, actually.
It is.
So let me ask you, there's a punchline in Human Action that really stuck with me too towards the end. Mm-hmm. And I'll try to frame it up, and I'd love to just hear your thoughts on it. And correct me anywhere I'm wrong here, as always. Mises, I think, makes the general assertion that for a tool to be successful in the marketplace, it just needs to be useful, basically. Like, if a hammer drives a nail better than every other hammer, then all things considered over the long run, it will pretty much proliferate and succeed. People will make use of it. But he makes this distinction that the ideologies under which we organize ourselves are different, and that it's not just the most useful ideology that wins out necessarily, that there is this component of public opinion that we actually have to win. There have to be advocates for a certain ideology that have to go into the forum of public opinion and win support for it. Mm-hmm. And I believe he's making the case, we kind of making a case for education, that you really needed to educate people about the principles of capitalism such that we did not try to adopt the principles of socialism. And again, his book's written in, I think he said 1949. So it was prescient, I think, in a lot of ways. We didn't completely know the dire implications of socialism at the time. I guess we kind of in the middle of it. And that just left a mark on me. It's like, okay, so I felt almost this sacred duty of some kind. It's like, if you're someone that can understand what this guy is saying and the implications of a market economy versus a socialized economy, which is basically slavery. I mean, I guess to sum it up, that you have this, felt and feel this impulsion to now go out and share and educate to the best of my ability others, so that you can win in the court of public opinion to get people, hopefully push history in the right direction, so that we organize ourselves in a way that's a net benefit for humanity, let's say. That was a bit of a mouthful,
Right.
but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, if you forgive me, let me just read this. So this is an excerpt. I just Googled a phrase that I knew would bring up the quote. So this is coming from near the end of Human Action in this section you're talking about. And so, yeah, the context is Mises is explaining, like, okay, we just went through 800 and some pages of me teaching you economics, and I've shown you how civilization itself rests on society, the division of labor, which in turn presupposes a basic respect for property rights and the use of money, having ownership in the means of production. People need to own factories. They need to own farmland. The government can't take control. This, I've shown you what would happen if we do go down that path. And you're right. He just, like, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's the physicists can know quantum physics, and there's some weird, counterintuitive, almost crazy stuff in quantum theory. And if the public thinks it's nutty, it doesn't matter, because the computers that use it will work.
Mm-hmm.
Like, in other words, the scientists who know quantum theory and then build things accordingly, their products are better. And like you say, the customer doesn't need to know how it works. They just need to know this computer works better than, something else. Whereas with economics, if the public doesn't understand it well enough, and they fall for politicians or others, strong men or whatever, who rise to power, making promises that aren't based on sound economics, it could be disastrous. So then Mises, let me just read this thing. Everyone carries a part of society on his shoulders. No one is relieved of his share of responsibility by others, and no one can find a safe way out for himself if society is sweeping toward destruction. Therefore, everyone in his own interest must thrust himself vigorously in the intellectual battle. None can stand aside with unconcern. The interest of everyone hangs in the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle, the decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us. So, you don't see that in most micro textbooks. So it is,
wow.
So that's what we're saying. It's that you can see why is it that Mises, why do I work for a thing called the Mises Institute? Why did somebody name something after this? Because he, like we said in the beginning, his book is difficult, it's Germanic, it's long sentences and whatever, but he does get you fired up when he writes stuff like that. Like, he's a serious guy, and he's saying this, this is why you need to know this, and you need to tell other people about this, because civilization hangs in the balance.
Yes. Wow. No, that I got chills from reading that again. That's probably the very passage that stuck with me. I take it Mises has been a big influence on your life. I mean, what is the impact you seek to create through your work? What?
To answer the first one, I mean, second to the Bible, which I sort of take for granted because I grew up, going to Catholic school, and so I'm calling myself Christian now, but that was such there that, that probably influenced it more. But other than that, in secular works, yes, Mises' Human Action influenced my worldview more than any other book by far. Because it's not just stuff like, oh, how does free trade work, or what causes the business cycle, even though that's all in there. But like, he says things like, all governments rest on the consent of the governed. Like, there's, in the long run, there can't be an unpopular government. Even dictators rest on public opinion. That's why they control the schools and the media, because they know if the public turns on me, then the military turns on me and I'm done. Right. So it's in the most totalitarian societies, they're actually the most fragile, and they control the information the most. It's not just who has more guns. They really need to control information. Right. So I'm just saying, the way I look at the world, like, came from Mises more than any other person. And so, what I'm trying to do is educate people, because it's when you learn how the world works, you realize all the excuses and justifications given for violence fall away. And so like the things that are, what the cause of the great injustices of our time, or, anybody's time, like a lot of that, the reason the public goes along with it is because they have been fooled by faulty doctrines. And so if you can correct those doctrines, that saps public support for these evil things that are happening, and that would tend to minimize them. So, I'm focusing largely up till now on economics because that's my area of training and I can do the most there. But, it's a broader issue.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's very, very interesting. And seems like the battle's really heating up. I mean, there's more bullshit than ever. I like to think I'm taking somewhat of an optimistic, I hope not naive view that this digital age is going to be really transformative. That, this type of engagement, we have more and more decentralized media. I hope that is an accelerant to the market process of ideas. If you want to say the liquidity of ideas has never been higher. And so that would help us to hopefully dispel a lot of these false doctrines on which current political power structures are premised. But the optimistic and hopefully not naive view I'm taking is that it's kind of darkest before dawn. So maybe we're going into that part of history where a lot of these institutions are starting to show their age and whatnot. Where do you think we are in terms of historical development, economic science? I haven't asked your views on Bitcoin. I don't know if you even think that's a big key piece to this or not. Just your general macro historical account of where we are and where you think we're headed.
Okay, sure. So I heard Jim Rogers say this, the investor. I don't know if he made this up or if he grabbed it from somebody else, but I definitely agree with it. He said that the 19th century was the British century, the 20th was the American, and the 21st is going to be the Chinese century. And I think that's true. And not that that's a good thing. I'm just saying that to me, that's what's going to happen. I don't think all of the landmass that's now called the United States is going to be part of the United States. Let's say 20 years from now. I mean, I don't. In other words, I think some states are going to break away. I'm really alarmed by the U.S. political culture right now. I'm just seeing like people hate each other's guts to a degree that I would not have thought possible 10 years ago. And so, some of it you could say, oh, well, it's just that social media is letting you see what was always there. And I think that's partly true, but I also think things really are inflamed right now, that there are people who would not bat an eye to see lots of other Americans die that wouldn't have been the case 20 years ago. Like there were not that many people who really just hate segments of, the country. And now I'm just seeing that more and more. But like you say, I am also, I do think, once we get through this coming calamity, it will, there will be a new age, not new age, like, in terms of new age philosophy or whatever, but, it's with technology, people going into space, that's going to keep developing. I do think, the crypto will revolutionize finance, whether it's going to be Bitcoin per se, or whether people will just look fondly back and say that was, the pioneer. And then we did so much more with it, that's, I'm not as sure about, but yes, like blockchain technology in general, I think that's going to be hundreds of years from now. People are going to say, yeah, when humans discovered how to use blockchains, that was a major innovation.
Interesting. Do you think
sorry, and just you're right. The decentralization of information. I was more optimistic. I thought there was I can't remember the title. I had something on my YouTube channel called something like Liberty Lovers Have 2 years or something goofy, like where I gave myself a real short time frame because I thought people are connected now. It's sort of like the neurons in a human brain. Like it's just all the interconnections and like people are now able to do all these things. And so like the processing power of this system is just, mind blowing. And that how can, the small elite control this mass of humanity when they're able to do all this stuff and end runs around major media. And that's still true, but I'm kind of amazed at the willingness of the public just to sit there and let the elites sort of take control of most of the flow of information.
Yeah.
In other words, like sort of negating a large portion of the ostensible benefits or the promise of what could have been from a free internet.
Yeah.
So it's, as always with this stuff, and I realized probably when they invented the printing press, certain advocates of human liberty thought, game over, we win. Now that we can crank out books, who could possibly stop us?
Yeah.
And, that's not what happened.
Right. Yeah. That's, I want to speak to that, but I wanted to first ask you a question about something you said earlier. The political polarization in the world. Do you think that's related to fiat currency or manipulation of the money supply in any way?
Well, I mean, certainly in the indirect way that modern states are vastly empowered by having recourse to a fiat printing press. They can wage war and they can do all sorts of stuff that they wouldn't be able to do if there was a hard money regime and they had to either directly tax or borrow from their, from the markets in an honest fashion without having a central bank waiting in the wings to monetize the debt. Yeah, the various governments of the world couldn't do all the sorts of things they've been doing that they can get away with fiat central banking. And so to that extent, yes, that a lot of the current thing that's happening, like you could say, oh, well, no, it's because of the higher education and all these Marxists on campus. Right. But why is higher education such a big thing? And how could it be that people who aren't teaching young people anything useful except to hate everybody?
Yeah. How
can that be a viable? Why are people paying $50,000 in tuition for their kids to learn awful, false things that just fill them with hate? Well, the government is involved. Here I'm speaking in the U.S. context. I'm sure you tweak the details. It's largely true in other Western nations. But so, yeah, if we had been on a hard money regime the whole time or hard money standard, then that wouldn't have been as bad.
Yeah. Yeah. There's this, I forget who said it. It's an Austrian, the monetary standard and the moral standard are inexorably linked. So I have this, I guess it's kind of a theory that we've just rotted ourselves, basically. Ever since going off the gold standard 1971, that it's caused the institutional rot we're seeing, the moral decay, the fiat culture, fiat art, fiat relationships. I think I'm not trying to isolate it as the sole cause, but I do think it's a large contributor.
Yeah. So I mean, there's definitely that it's part of it. What I'm not so sure about is that the way to think of it? That it was the decision to abandon sound money that then led to all these things, or is it that the cultural Marxists with bringing in postmodernism and this and that and blowing up the idea of absolute truth?
Right.
Is that the higher level thing, and then that seeped into everything, including money? So it's possible that's the way.
Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah. I've kind of viewed that anchor to gold as kind of it's a mooring of society, right? Kept the state honest, which then kind of keeps people more honest, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you remove that, you have that unmooring. That gives you much more of that postmodern relativistic dynamic where nothing means anything, everything's relative to everything. There's no anchor. Right.
Can I tell you a funny anecdote? So the guys like Paul Krugman, when people were arguing about, inflation, after the 2008, 2009, crisis, and the Fed pumps in all the money with various rounds of QE, and the people on the right are freaking out and warning about Zimbabwe and stuff. And Krugman's mocking them all, of course. And he would often bring up, apparently, when Great Britain in the early 30s, I think it was 31, but I might be off there. In the early 30s, Great Britain went off the gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
So they had done it. The major powers all did it in World War I, but then they went back on gold, and Great Britain, infamously went to the pre-war parity, and that caused deflation and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but then they threw in the towel in the early 30s and just said, no, we're going off gold. And apparently what was he? The head of the Exchequer. I don't know how to say that. The British, EXCH, Exchequer.
Exchequer or something like that.
Yeah. Apparently, when they made that decision, he said, this is the end of Western civilization.
Huh.
And so the Keynesians all mock that guy. And my point is, he said in the early 1930s in Europe, this is the end of Western civilization. What would have had to happen for him to be right?
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So really, they're just like, oh, well, no, everything else would have happened anyway. But I'm saying they're just acting like it's self-evident that this guy's an idiot because, you believe in your hard money and you got to, be an honest banker. And it was like, the 30s and 40s were pretty bad. Like that arguably was the end of Western civilization.
Yeah.
So,
wow, that's interesting. Well, I think it's pretty apparent that the scale, scope, and duration of World War II would not have been possible without fiat currency printing press.
Even the defenders of fiat money say that, right? Like that's actually one of the number one reasons they'll give is to say, well, what if there's a national emergency? We need to leave gold, to defend the country. So they'll admit that the gold standard prevents governments from waging, massive prolonged war.
Yeah. And this is where, again, I think Bitcoiners, I see it this way. I see Bitcoin as a digital disruptor to gold. So I hope to see it succeed in a way that reinstills the discipline that gold used to exert on government in a way that can't be monopolized or coerced. And a lot of this has to do with really the technological advantages of Bitcoin. You don't need to centralize its custody to scale it for a globe, basically. Gold did not scale well for a globalizing society. That was kind of the purpose of central banking and warehousing more generally. We needed to abstract it into a currency so we could transact more easily. Bitcoin doesn't suffer from those disadvantages. And then it also holds its value across time. In theory, I know the verdict's still out, but the fixed supply gives it very optimal store value properties. And to the point you made earlier about the internet, I agree with you. The internet, the original promise of it has been somewhat abandoned. We have given into this kind of platform application layer movement and control, which the, quote unquote elites have kind of gotten their hands into. It's become the new media, essentially what's being controlled and manipulated. But another interesting thing about Bitcoin, this is very, very early, is that you can build media tools on top of it that are as censorship resistant as Bitcoin itself. So for instance, this podcast goes up on a platform. This is just one of many. It's just one I'm familiar with. It's called Sphinx Chat. And it's published there and it can't be censored. It can't be taken down because it's built on the Lightning Network, which is built on Bitcoin. So my hope there is that Bitcoin offers us this layer for an uncensorable internet, because I don't think we're going to ever be able to realize the dream that Mises laid out for us without unstoppable money and unstoppable speech tools, if you will. Hey,
Robert, can I just ask you, because I hadn't heard that particular, in the same way that like they can't really take down Bitcoin, that they could knock out anybody's computers and that would just be a copy of the blockchain, but there's other copies floating out there, and so that's why you couldn't censor like your podcast that's published there. Is that what you're getting at? That there's no central node to knock out?
That's right. Yeah. So the Lightning Network is a transactional layer. It's built on top of Bitcoin. It's still beta, I guess you might say. It's operational. It's moving a lot of funds, but And what it does is, because Bitcoin doesn't move a lot of transactions per second, this is like a smart contract layer that trades off some of the trust minimization of final settlement. Like if I settle with you, if I send you a Bitcoin transaction and there's 6 confirmations on chain, I've basically handed you a gold coin. It's an irreversible transaction, right? No one can censor it or whatever. Lightning Network gives up a little bit of that trust minimization because you're actually trusting the smart contract, but it lets you perform as the network density increases. The upper limit is unlimited. Actually, in theory, you could have unlimited transactions per second in Bitcoin. So unlimited transactions per second, global final settlement. And then one other benefit is you can build other applications on top of it. So you're moving these sats around, which can be piggybacked with messages. So you have this unstoppable media tool. It could be chat, messaging, podcasting, social media, anything. So it's early, but there's this great hope for Bitcoin to kind of reinvigorate the original promise of the internet.
Okay, great. Yeah. Like I said, I had heard of smart contracts and all these other applications and things, but I actually didn't realize that information transmission was fast enough that a video podcast would be able to be distributed that way. So
yeah, it's only audio that I'm posting now. I don't know.
It's just the audio. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if they do video yet, but again, these things are all so new. I think Sphinx Chat's a few months old. Lightning Network's a couple of years old, Bitcoin 12 years old. So, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it is kind of binary though. Technology has opened up this spectrum of possibility, and it's either going to be this Orwellian dystopian thing where it's all fully controlled and we're all on social credit scores and central bank digital currency wallets and all that, or there's this possibility that an unmonopolizable money could emerge and really separate money from state in a way that would be much more in line with the bright future Mises said was possible. So like you, I want to fight for that. I think that the battle occurs in the educational domain. So that's what I hope to help keep having great conversations like this to help broaden awareness.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that. And you're right. I'm glad you're doing what you're doing too, because it is right. With a lot of this stuff, if people could just see it, then it would be obvious. You know what I mean? Like, so again, with these things, and that's the problem. And the people implementing these nefarious schemes from our perspective, that's not how they're selling it. It's all about, we got to protect people from drug dealers and we got to do this. And, and we're just here to ensure financial integrity and things like, so it's amazing to me why so many people keep believing it when, like, look at all the examples of how these people are not trustworthy, but be that as it may.
It's interesting with Austrian economics too, because it almost is, once you have a general understanding, it seems a little bit obvious in retrospect. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just a biased opinion, but you look at some of this Keynesian stuff and it just doesn't make any sense. But Austrian economics is reasonable. It's like you can think through it and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it's got that quality to it. But it's also, like we've explored in this podcast, very difficult to kind of break the surface of it. Like, to really get into that mode of thinking is you have to unlearn a lot and sort of shift your perspective in a way that takes a lot of effort. So I don't know. I have hope that people could get their heads around it, but I think it's going to take time. So just got to keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah. Just to amplify what you just said there. Yeah, I would. So after the 2008 crisis, my phone metaphorically was ringing off the hook and people would have me come out like, what the heck just happened? And then start doing QE, and I was going around giving PowerPoint presentations to like when I say regular people, I don't just mean, Austrians or like college kids who, loved libertarianism or something. I mean like regular people in the financial sector or their clients who just wanted an economist to come and just explain what happened with the housing bubble. I don't get what's going on. Is the dollar going to crash? And so I would give them a crash course in what was Austrian business cycle theory, but I wouldn't call it that. I would just say, here's what happened with interest rates. Look at the housing bubble, blah, blah, blah. And then, they started raising rates, and it was a pretty compelling, and it was common sense. Like, saying if what got us into this crisis was people living beyond their means, you don't fix that by the Fed creating money out of thin air to buy government debt so politicians could spend more than they have. Yes. That doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
And here's why. And I'd go through and show, here's the pedigree, and Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize, and
Yeah.
And people would come up after and say things like, I knew something was screwy when I was watching TV, and they would say how the way to fix this was the government needs to borrow money and it doesn't even matter what they spend it on. Like, I knew that couldn't be right.
Yes.
But I'm glad or they would say, this is just common sense. Or they would often say, this made so much more sense than the economics I took in college.
Yes,
things like that. So you're right. On the one hand, it is like the reason regular people like Austrian economics is it is common sense, but more rigorous.
Mm-hmm.
But like you say, on the other hand, it's tough at first. And it's, and also depending, on the person, like it's a hard pill to swallow. Like if right now, if you said to me, okay, what should they do? And said the Fed should stop inflating for sure, let interest rates rise to their natural levels. Then they said, well, wouldn't that cause a huge crash? And I would say, yes, because a crash is happening no matter what. The question is just, do you want to make it worse, or let's get it over with?
Yeah.
And people don't want to hear that. So someone else comes along and says, no, don't listen to these doom and gloomers. We're just going to do a soft landing, and we're watching it. We're going to tweak and blah, blah, blah. Then people would rather hear that. And certainly the politicians would rather advance, and hoist up the people saying massive government deficits are what we need when the private sector is deleveraging.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think Mises said once you start manipulating the currency, you either get the deflationary bust to reality or the crack up boom. Right. And it appears that central banks and politicians have precedent and incentive to push us towards the crack up boom hyperinflation scenario. I don't know, that seems like we would see it in the next few decades, because the acceleration on, just USM2 is unbelievably high now. I think 40% annual increase last year.
Yeah, right. Yeah. If you look at certain, and the M1 metric is tricky because they redefined it.
Yes.
Retroactive to May 2020. And so there's a big spike.
Yeah.
But even with the old definition, there was a huge spike in M1 in 2020. Like, I'm actually so cynical. I almost wonder if that's why they did it. So that when people see the huge spike, they say, oh no, don't worry about that. That's just because of a redefinition. I was like, no, actually half the spike was real and the other half is, the statistical. Yes. And you're right. The way to wash that out is just look at M2, because M2 was not affected by the redefinition.
Yeah.
So with all this stuff, and it's the difficulty is, like, me personally, if you go to my Wikipedia page, you would think I was born and then I lost an inflation bet. Like, that looks like the summary of my life. Because in like 2010-ish, I was very concerned about QE, and some of my colleagues who were, free market people, one was Brian Kaplan, an anarcho-capitalist. The other guy was David Henderson, who was not an anarchist, but a very small government guy, and not a Keynesian at all. And I bet that they just thought I was more alarmed about price inflation than was warranted. And so we had bets on what would happen to CPI, and I was wrong.
Yeah.
And Paul Krugman, was running victory laps on that and just loves to talk about, these. So I'm saying that I can't sit here and be like, how can these idiots, not know the writing on the wall, because I was thinking it was going to hit sooner. I thought by now it would be obvious, that we wouldn't still, gasoline would be a lot more expensive per gallon than it is right now. And so is that just because investors around the world are fools, or is it because something's wrong with the way you and I are looking at it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the CPI, we know that's a flawed metric. And then two, this time, I hate to say this time is different. I know those are infamous last words, but the distribution of the money is different. The bank's capitalization is different. And, we have had inflation. It's just been, I think when it's been asset inflation. Let's just put it that way. It's like as the disparity between rich and poor grows, there's more more of the newly created money is going to get stuck at the top in asset prices. It just makes sense that the rich would get richer as a result. So I'm not familiar with your bet scenario, but I just know that people looking to CPI and saying there's no inflation, I just don't think that's a valid narrative, frankly.
Well, sure. And also too, what's funny is, as I'm sure you know, even using the government's own CPI numbers recently, they were like the highest in 30 years, depending on whether it's core, PCE, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So even their own metrics are blown. And I think that's partly why they switched to average inflation targeting last summer, is to give themselves cover. So now they can be above target and say, yeah, but we're just saying on average, since we were running cold, now we're going to run hot for a few. But what I mean though is, like, if we're worried about the dollar collapsing, then they can do whatever statistical tricks they want. If gasoline's $20 a gallon, people are going to know that.
That's right.
You know what I mean? Or like in Zimbabwe, the government couldn't have convinced everybody that no, actually, there's no inflation. Given what happened, you know what I mean? Yes. So that's what I mean. That what I think is coming is going to be so obvious. It's not that statistical sleights of hand are going to be able to hide it. Even though I agree with everything you're saying, that when I go to the grocery store now, even if I go to the cheap stores, it's like I'm spending more than $100, and a few years ago I would have spent 50. And it's like, what's going on here? And the paper towels are thinner, and
shrinkflation. I joke with some of my friends that are outside of economics. It's like, well, the good news is we're all going to be billionaires, but the bad news is we're going to be broke billionaires.
Right.
Bob, this has been awesome, man. I really appreciate you talking to me about Austrian econ. It is not an easy subject to crack, but as we talked about, I think very important. And we're living through the emergence of a new science. So I'm glad there's people like you carrying the torch that Mises was carried for a long time. And I hope we can, just help shine the way towards a brighter future. So.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Robert. And again, I'm glad that, you've got your show and you're trying to get the word out as well. And that, Satoshi and the other innovators in the crypto space are doing what they're doing. Because this could very well be, one of the key innovations that helps the, carrying on the torch of liberty.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you.